What's up? What's up, witches? How we doing? Woo! Welcome. It is so great to see all of you. Welcome, welcome, welcome. This is a bit of a surprise for everyone. I am super excited to be back at it, recording episodes of the BetterWitch podcast. Okay, I know y'all have missed it. Thank you guys so much for rocking with me over this time. It has been quite a journey over the last 5 years since we got started together here on YouTube, formerly the Bronx Switch page. And I've got more changes coming up, more shifts, more adjustments. So be on the lookout for some update videos and definitely take a look around the channel because there are going to be some changes going on here that I think everyone is going to love. Your girl is leveling up. So the platform's getting a level up. Okay. She's going to be cute. She's going to be very demure. Okay. But she's going to be the next generation. And I'm excited for you all to see that. But I wanted to get started on recording episodes for the next season of the podcast while all these things are happening, so that you guys are a part of it and you're here with me as I'm getting things ready for you. If you are totally new here, hi, I'm Allie, aka Bronx Switch. I am the owner of Bronx Switch Headquarters, the only co working space for spiritual practitioners here in the Bronx, New York. And I am also the CEO of BetterWitch Coaching, which is a class and coaching program and platform for witches that are looking to become better witches. I offer classes and coaching on topics like magic and most recently on spiritual entrepreneurship, which reflects my journey over these last 5 years of opening a physical location and going into business for myself and helping other witches to do the same. And that's really unlocked a new passion for me. So for the last year or so, that's what I've been doing in addition to running the shop, but taking on clients who are tarot readers, Reiki healers, massage therapists, hypnotists, you name it, who want to take their spiritual gifts and turn them into thriving businesses and perhaps transition from their 9 to 5 jobs into doing their spiritual work full time is something I've been able to do for myself. And now I'm helping others. So I'm really, really excited about that. And this channel and all of my platforms are, falling in line with that alignment for me. So shout out to all of you guys for going along for the ride, and for all of you who are excited about this future for the platform. And certainly if you are a spiritual practitioner, tap in with me. Okay. I want to help you to replace your 9 to 5 with your spiritual gift if that's something that you want to do. So the episodes that I'm going to be recording moving forward for the podcast are obviously going to be magical and spiritual in nature because we witches, okay? But I am a firm believer that when you know better, you witch better, right? That's our tagline around here. So we will definitely continue to speak with witches and practitioners who have an immense amount of knowledge in their areas of study. But we're also going to be talking to some professionals that can help you. So if you are a reader, healer, etc., you want to build a business, then you need to know people like virtual assistants and lawyers and accountants. And the beautiful thing about our world today is there are so many professionals who specifically cater to spiritual and magical entrepreneurs, which I didn't even really realize. But as I've been on my journey, I've been finding more and more people who don't just make websites, they make websites for witches. And they don't just do bookkeeping, they do bookkeeping for spiritual solopreneurs. So I want to bring those people into our space so we can learn more on the magical side, but also on the professional side. So I'm really excited about what's coming up for the podcast. I'm very excited about today because we have a special guest today, and the topic and the guests I really feel are perfect for this segue, if you want to call it, into a world in which we talk about magic and spirituality, but we also focus on our personal and our professional development. Because today we're going to be talking about ancestry and connecting with our ancestors, which is obviously a topic that witches talk about quite a bit these days. But I wanted to talk about this topic generally because I do believe it's important to your practice. I didn't always feel that way, but I now do because of my own experiences. But also, I want to talk about this topic through a lens that you guys might not be used to, which is talking about it through the lens of professional development and pursuits. Why are you interested in certain things? Are there people in your family that have followed certain paths, taken on certain professions, created certain businesses, or served certain roles in their community? And if so, like, do you carry that with you? Does that mean that you would be good at that thing? Or maybe it's an explanation for why you're interested in it. I don't know. These are some of the questions I'm asking myself, but we're going to be able to ask somebody who knows a lot more about the topic. And that is Ben Stimson, the author of Ancestral Whispers. So, Ben is an integrative therapist, spiritual director, and award winning author, podcaster, and independent scholar of folklore and history. Ben is a member of the modern neo-pagan and queer communities. Ben's personal life helps to inform his professional and research work. Ben holds a BA, honors BA, in medieval classical and religious studies from the University of Waterloo, a postgraduate diploma in spiritual psychotherapy, and a diploma in social service work. As a therapist, he excels in working with members of the queer community and other marginalized populations, and ascribes to personal, transpersonal, systemic, and narrative approaches to therapy. He is the host of Essence Podcast, a weekly show interviewing fellow authors of practitioners of magic, therapy, and folklore. His debut title, Ancestral Whispers, A Guide to Developing an Ancestral Veneration Practices, won the 2024 gold medal at the COVR Awards. He is currently working on a title for the History Press, set to publish in 2025, on the witches and cunning folk of Wales. You can learn more about Ben and his work on his website at benstimson.com. Welcome, Ben. It is so great to
Hello.
see you.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to our chat today because this is one of my major interest topics. And it's something that I find a lot of people are very challenged by because it gets to the question of what do we consider as an ancestor. So I'm really interested in getting into this with you.
Yeah, same. That topic really, like that question resonates really deeply with me because I am adopted myself. And this is going to blow your mind. I spoke for the first time with my birth mother about 2 weeks ago at the age of 38. Yes.
Wow.
Shout out to ancestry.com. Speaking of, yeah, well, and that's also where I found out I was 12% Welsh, as we were discussing
Yes,
a moment ago, which is also eye-opening to me. I was like, what? But yeah, so I am adopted. That actually led me to teach a class called Orphaned Ancestry, specifically for witches that are estranged from their families, are adopted, are foster children, just don't want to have anything to do with their families. Their families don't want to have anything
very
to do with
common. Yeah.
them. Very common,
Very
right?
much so. Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to taking this class and talking about it specifically through the queer lens at the Queer Magic Weekend. I might have the word wrong, but Matt Warren's hosting a retreat
Yes.
at
Looking
the
forward to
Omega
that.
Institute. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm going to be able to take those concepts and talk about it specifically for queer folk because we definitely
We'll totally
have
Yeah.
some disconnects with our families, immediate family, extended family, etc. But specifically on the question of who can be your ancestors, obviously we have our biological ancestors, right? And we know that. But when you talk about who is an ancestor, that to me suggests that there may be folks that are not biologically related to me that might fall into that ancestral category. And I've certainly had my personal experiences that make me know that there are energies around me that are assisting me, that are available to me, that are not related to me because I literally am just meeting the people I'm related to. So can you speak a little bit about that in your studies and your own experiences for folks who are just wondering who my ancestors even are?
Yeah.
is Marilyn Monroe one of them? I really, feel connected to her. Should I set up an altar to her? Is she going to come and help me out with my goals? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I took a lot of time to really reflect on this question because you're right. A lot of people in the magical communities, a lot of people in general in the Western world, even all over the world, have at times a very strange relationship with their biological ancestors. And, as a queer person myself, but also as somebody, as an immigrant, I came to Canada when I was 8 years old. All of my biological ancestors were still in the UK. Wales, England, Scotland, Ireland, and down south there. So I was literally disconnected from all of that ancestry. All I had was my biological family over here, and that was it, my core immediate family. So when I started a few years ago, about 6-7 years ago, I started to become involved with Lukumi, a Cuban Orisha tradition, and one of the main ATRs, I would say, in the United States, thanks to Voodoo. And that cultural understanding of what ancestor is so different from Western, because you have lineage ancestors, you have ancestors of the space that you're in. You have ancestors that are divine, right? You said, I picked up on this. You said, who is your ancestors? I would say, who or what is your ancestry? Because I think for a lot of Westerners, because of the way the funeral industry has evolved over the past 100 years, because of Judeo-Christianity, because of, and I use that term very, very loosely there, it's an inappropriate term in many ways, but that kind of Western idea, even going back to the old Roman Empire, this is where my classical bent comes in. Ancestry was connected, and the even idea of ancestry was connected in with legality. And so who was going to be taking on the role of, your estate, right? Way back in the ancient Roman world, in the ancient world, adoption was a very legitimate thing. You had Roman emperors who were adopting their children, and they would literally then take on the mantle. Oh yeah, Augustus Caesar was Julius Caesar's adopted son, but he referred to, after that point, and he was adopted later in life, he was like 24 or something like that when he was adopted, my father Julius Caesar, my father Julius Caesar. That became both a legal and a spiritual adoption, right? So in many ways, how we even think of ancestor is really culturally derived, and it has a huge history and long history, but we get so caught up in this sense of, then who are my ancestors, right? And I think in the Western world, that sense of adoption causes a lot of people a lot of grief, because there's always that subtext in Western culture which says, well, you're not really theirs. You might be adopted, but you're not really theirs. And that causes a lot of grief. Now, my experience working with my kind of biological ancestral line, working backwards, and everybody will find this, is eventually you will get to a point where one of your ancestors was adopted. And for me, that's on my father's side, on his maternal side, 5 generations back. Now, working with the ancestors who adopted that person, there's no difference. And so that really opened up for me when I was communicating with him and working with him in a spiritual sense. That really opened up for me this idea of spirits adopt, just in the same way that when somebody is initiated into a system, the spirits of that tradition adopt. That person becomes transformed and part of the tribe, part of that community, part of the clan, part of whatever language we're using. So then I went on a journey of, okay, well, if the concept of what an ancestor is, the definition of what an ancestor is so culturally bound, then let's just expand that. So for me, an ancestor now, and I really teach this, is anything or anyone who has impacted who I've become. So that opens me up to lineage ancestors, fictional ancestors. If I have parasocial relationships with fictional characters, going back when I was a child, they are ancestral to who I've become. So then we start to really kind of look at this idea of what's ancestral versus what's divine versus what's, that starts to really open up. And then we start to look at Venn diagrams, we start to see a spectrum, and that creates opportunity as long as you have that relationship. It always comes back to relationship. So Marilyn Monroe may not be a biological ancestor to somebody, but if you have a parasocial relationship with the spirit of Marilyn Monroe, because that idea, that image, that belief of Marilyn Monroe in your life has impacted who you are, then she's ancestral to you. And indeed, we see this in Espiritismo, in traditions down in South America, in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Asia. We see this courts of spirits who become ancestral. And this is where we lead into then professional ancestors, lineage ancestors within professions. We look at, say, Florence Nightingale. To anybody who is a nurse in the Western world, she's an ancestor to that profession, right?
Mm-hmm.
You look at, I don't know, anybody who has taken art classes, right? Michelangelo, or Hayao Miyazaki, right?
Yep.
You know, those are ancestral to somebody's practices, right? As an artist, we start to open that up. So that's really the journey I've come to, is then looking at more of the relationship. How is this relationship impacting who I am?
Right.
And then we open up to ancestors being not just dead people, but also other things, the landscape, right? For me, the landscape that I come from, you know, the United Kingdom and then Britain in general, is an ancestral landscape, but it's also a divine being for me. And so that divine being is an ancestor to me. So many questions, so many ways we can go with it, you know?
Yeah, no, I've heard it said that, you know, the trees are our oldest ancestors. And I really love your definition of ancestry being about those, or those energies, regardless of whether they're like contained in a human form, that have had an impact on us. I think is a way to help people understand what that is, and then provides an answer for questions like, well, what about my younger cousin that passed away? She was younger than me. Is she an ancestor? I get that question a lot. Was this a child that passed on, or somebody that I never met, but that was in the family? And to me, it sounds like you're saying, if you ask the question of whether or not this person's existence or this being's existence had an impact on me, that gives you perhaps a more accurate idea of what qualifies or who qualifies as an ancestor than perhaps the question of direct genetic relationship.
It totally does. But I would even go I would go further than that. And I would encourage that person to even look at the definitions and how they're framing the relationship. You know, I am going to do ancestor work. So does this mean that my cousin who died is an ancestor? If they're not an ancestor, then I can't work with them because they're not an ancestor. But they're a spirit, right? They're a part of the family. They're a part of that relationship, right? And so I feel like a lot of people, especially in the West, because I think partly, and I hope my publisher's not watching this, but I think a lot of people in the past 50 years in these communities have become so used to, I'm a green witch, I'm an ancestral witch, I'm a this, I'm a that, and then kind of defining or trying to stick many, many different things into particular categories and boxes.
Right.
That it becomes confusing of, well, what about this person, or what about this thing, or what about this, right? And this is then where I would say and encourage people to look at those definitions in the same way that we would when we're looking at business. Look at how what are the limiting narratives that you're working with, right? In the same way I would work with therapists, in the same way you would work with business coaching. How are those categories limiting you, right? What's your worldview here, right?
That's interesting to think that the more flexible definition actually is less limiting. Like you would think that like the more clear definition, I guess, or the more rigid definition would allow you to be like, okay, yes, this person, yes, that person. But actually it kind of like gets you into this like technical mishmash kind of thing that like isn't really necessary. Like if you approach it from a more flexible perspective, then you really get to just tap into, do I feel that I am directly impacted in some way by the existence of this person, of this being, this concept, this landscape, this country, rather than the other way around? And you're echoing something that Corey Hutchison said
Oh, yes.
on this program, well, magic is all about relationships. It's all about
It is.
relationships. And I really try to
Yes.
emphasize that with my students as much as possible when
Yeah.
they have questions like, can I substitute this, or why do that, or what else could I use for that? And if you bring it back to this is a relationship,
Mhm.
if you bring it back to, yes, this culture would traditionally honor, let's say, this deity or this ancestor in this way, but you have a relationship with this deity or this ancestor, and therefore that is more, should provide more of a guidance for you than what someone else has done,
Mm.
even if it's an entire group of people. And I think that kind of takes us into something that's mentioned over in the chat about venerating um, specific cultures that we're connected to. And certainly
Mhm.
anyone tuning in, drop your questions in the chat. We'll do a Q&A down at the end. But I just wanted to swing over to this because it was more of a comment than a question, and it's relevant to this concept and what we were talking about me discovering things, and so many people discovering
Mm.
things about their ancestry through DNA testing, which is now readily available to the average
Absolutely.
person,
Absolutely.
something that's very
Yeah.
new for us. And so, for the person who's just discovering that they have Irish ancestors or that they
Mhm.
have Welsh ancestors,
Mm.
and they haven't necessarily known this before,
Mhm.
um, what thoughts do you have on that? Like, how do I process that in terms of
Yeah.
relationships? Because if I'm just discovering today, as I have, that I'm 10% or so Welsh,
Mhm. Mhm.
well, I have to imagine that that's impacted me in some way. But because I wasn't aware of it before, I have no connection to anyone
Mm.
in Wales or that extension of my lineage. Has it impacted me? Now what do I do? Do I now need to get on a
Yeah.
plane and go track down, three cousins 3 times removed? Or how do
Yeah.
I deal with new information about my ancestry?
This is the thing, and I think this is the struggle, because I want to pick up on something you said about relationships, right? So, like, when we look at most traditional cultures around the world, they are relationships in motion, right? They are relationships between specific spirits and the kind of the descendants of the community that have been working with those spirits for a very long time. That's relationship in motion, right? A big issue with cultural appropriation that I really like to get people to understand is that it isn't necessarily just the damage that you're doing to living cultures if you're, wanting to work with a spirit and taking and all of that, right? It's the relationship that you're entering into. And if the
Mhm.
spirit has instituted, or the orishas, or the deities, or the devas, or however way you want to talk, the gods, if they're the ones who have created and co-created their relationships with their particular group, then coming in the respectful way of even forming a relationship with a deity, or a spirit, or whatever you want to call it, is to enter into the preferred method that they've developed, which is within their community, right? And I think this ties in with this idea of, if somebody finds that they have ancestry in Wales or Ireland or anywhere, because it's anywhere. We see this with Native American ancestry, we see this with African ancestry, we see this with Asian ancestry, whatever the ancestry happens to be. Somebody grows up believing and understanding that they are one thing, and then they find that there is this sliver of this ancestry that they had no idea about. Yes, it will have impacted, but that doesn't mean that you then have relationship with that community, with that pantheon, with those spirits. But it also doesn't mean that you can't then go and introduce yourself, right? Coming back to what you were saying, and forgive me if you
Mhm.
said this on camera. I hope that you said this. You said that you had just met your
Yeah.
biological family, right?
Yeah. 38 years
Yeah.
old. I was given up for adoption, closed adoption in the 80s.
Wow.
It up until recently, it would typically be very difficult to get information. And then some laws have changed, but also, DNA genetic testing that can just come in a box to your house is now a thing. And thanks to that, I now have plans to meet my biological family for the first time in my life.
It is powerful, right?
Yeah.
And even with what you just said, you have plans to go and meet your biological family. Now, that's going to take a certain form. There's going to be a way that you already have that connection, but you're not going to barge in and ask for, oh, can I get college tuition, by the way? Or can you get this to me? Now, like, we're related, so can I?
I mean, that would be nice. Though I was
Yeah, I
hoping
know.
when I first spoke to my mom, I was, as a kid, knowing that you're adopted, you always say ridiculous things like, my real mother's Madonna, and she's just gonna come back and save me one day. I'm telling you, I'm getting out of this place. But I was waiting for that when she picked up the phone. I was like, so am I like, the heiress to the Johnson Foundation? She's like, we're just regular people in Georgia. We've always wanted to meet you. And I'm like, okay. Oh, great.
It would be nice, wouldn't it? It would be nice, right?
Yeah.
You never know. You never know,
Yeah.
right? But I mean, like that in itself, right? Is you've already got an in, you've already got a connection, you're already joking, right? That's a way of building that relationship. You're not like that plumber from Texas who went to the Isle of Man and declared himself the Lord of the Isle of Man because he had, some, gateway ancestor 400 years ago, and he was just parading around the island, and the island just was like, the fuck are you? It's like, what is this?
Like,
right?
What?
So it takes you develop relationship, right? You don't already have relationship, and but I think again that's freeing, because if we go into this idea with anything, and say, like I think mine is something like 25% Scandinavian heritage, right? Which makes total sense for kind of where my family comes from in the UK, right? Large areas of that 1,000 years ago was colonized, right, by Scandinavians. But that doesn't mean I can go to Norway and start worshipping the Norse gods and be like, these are my deities because my ancestors had those relationships. My ancestors had those relationships. I don't. But because I can build relationship with my ancestors can help me develop relationship with those, right? And I think that's the key piece there, is that we have an in suddenly. We have an invitation. We can go in and build our own relationships, right?
Love that. I love that. That is actually like a perfect time and a perfect topic to take a quick break on. So go ahead and fill up your teacup switches, and we will be back in just a few moments to continue this conversation on connecting with your ancestry with Ben Stimson. All right. Woo. Do you want to fill your tea or anything? Do you need to step away?
I came prepared.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Me too. I've got my water bottle. I got my coffee. I'm like extra ready. I'll take this moment to shout out everybody in the chat that's tuning in. What's up, witches? Welcome to the room. Super excited if you just came in to be filming season 4 and kicking it off with Ben Stimson. We're talking about connecting with our ancestry. And if you just got here, you might have missed at the beginning where I was talking a little bit about the direction that this channel and this podcast are going, bringing in more information that is helpful to my spiritual entrepreneurs. Because so many of us are not only diving into our practices more deeply, but are considering doing them professionally. And that's the type of world that I want to see. And it's the type of world that I'm creating. And so I'm offering business coaching after building my business for the last 5 years to other practitioners that want to do something similar in their lives. And so I really want to make sure I bring as many people together that can help us with that, because when you know better, you witch better. Okay. It's all about knowledge. Okay. It's all about knowledge. Someone said, a sage said, thank you for that last statement, Ben. You validated what I'm doing in my practice. This is really beautiful. Thanks for sharing that feedback, Sage. So if you guys have any questions, you can drop them into the chat. We will have a brief Q&A at the end of our conversation. So you can drop it in there now. Otherwise, I'll cue the Q&A in a little bit. But for now, we're going to get back to our conversation, okay? All right, witches, we are back with Ben Stimson, author of Ancestral Whispers, talking about connecting with our ancestors. And, we've talked a little bit about who or what those are, what and who our ancestors actually are. And we started to talk a little bit about, what's appropriate, what isn't appropriate, perhaps, as we, try to forge relationships, maybe with entire cultures that we maybe only recently came to know about. What I want to talk about now is kind of related to that in terms of like our professions and our professional development. Something that I find to be really interesting, and obviously I don't have like empirical data about this, so it's very anecdotal, but something that I find really interesting is it often seems that when people talk about making discoveries about their ancestry, biological or not, they will often realize that someone in their family has done what they're doing professionally, and like across the board, like everybody that I talk to will be like, oh my gosh, I found out that my great great grandma was like the baker of the town, like everybody went to her, she cooked for everyone, she cooked for every event. And so I don't really believe in coincidences, and so I don't think that that's random. Um, what have you learned, like in your studies and experiences with that? Does that hold true for you? Do you hear that story repeated often? And if
It
so, like
really
what do we make of that? Like if we are passionate about something, can our ancestors help with that? Should I go figure out which ancestor did the thing that I'm trying to do? Or like
does.
how can my ancestral practice assist me with like my personal and professional goals?
Absolutely. So, this is something that's been a long-standing understanding within therapy circles, and that is the idea of families as systems and self-perpetuating systems. And
Mm.
so, there's really two layers, multiple layers going on here that kind of correlate. So,
Is
on
this
the
like when people say generational curses?
yeah,
Like these repeated patterns? Okay. Okay.
yeah, and connected to that, so you've got the kind of the purely like sociological systemic view, but interconnected to that, you've also got the energetic and the magical view too. So the purely psychotherapeutic systemic view, when you look at families as systems, they tend to want to perpetuate themselves. And this, when I say family system, I mean these are the this is a way that core families are organized in order to perpetuate family rules, family culture, family viewpoints, right? So when you've got two people who come together, oftentimes they're attracted to each other partially, subconsciously, because those other partners fit certain needs. So they can be unhealthy needs or they can be healthy needs. Oftentimes they tend to be unhealthy. So you tend to find like, perfectionists who are looking for people who they can kind of perpetuate that perfectionism. Or you've got people who are, you might have a mother who is wanting to be needed, and so she's a people pleaser. And then you've got a father who wants somebody to need to wait on them, and so you've got that dynamic, right? As people become more and more aware of these generational curses or generational traumas, is another way to look at it. They tend to, shift those patterns. But when you look back in multiple generations, you can usually see where your context now and your upbringing, that kind of nature versus nurture debate, right, originated. So while I was doing my training, I did something called a genogram, which is a very specific tool used by social workers and psychotherapists and doctors to track information back through generations. Doctors will use it for diagnoses. Social workers will look at like kind of systems and like, socializations and relationships sort of thing. Same with therapists. And what was very interesting is that you can look back and you can see the origins of narratives that we grew up in. And this is where the whole, if you're adopted, if you're not adopted, it doesn't matter, because you're still socialized into this family culture regardless. So in my case, for example, when I did my family tree as part of this big project, I saw that both sides on my maternal and my paternal 6 generations ago. Both of those families were in the workhouse in the same decade. Now, the workhouse was like penury prison. Because England at that time didn't have a social safety net. So those people who really fell onto rough times put themselves into the workhouse, which was a debtor's prison, basically. And you worked your way out of it until you were eventually able to work your way out of it. And it was hard, tough living. So in my family, both of those families generated children who went on and they trained in the trades. And on one side of my family, it was a cobbler, a shoemaker. He became a shoemaker's apprentice. Basically, it was a way of indentured servitude. These children, 8 or 9 years old, were sold to local like shoemakers, candle makers, bakers, whatever. And they were trained, exactly. They were trained, and then they eventually grew out and they went and they became their own professions.
Right.
And so the narrative that I grew up with was, in my family, be self-employed, because being self-employed means you have power. Don't work for anybody else, because working for somebody else means you're disempowered. And that was what both my sides of my family were really pushing. Go figure that both my grandfathers were plumbers, both their grandfathers were plumbers, so on and so on, so back, right? But that also caused a lot of issues. You know, my parents were workaholics. That generated some alcoholism in the family. That generated some real stress-related issues, right? And even now, my parents have a hard time being retired, because after 60 years of being self-employed in various different capacities, they have a really hard time thinking, what am I to do, right? And yet with that, there's also strengths. Strengths came down through the family line, right? So it doesn't matter if I'm not a plumber, I can still appreciate that as a self-employed plumber in the 1940s and 50s or the 1920s in that particular area of the UK, you needed a great deal of fortitude. Go figure that both my great-grandfathers on both sides during World War I were also part of the black market, right? They were entrepreneurs in the Peaky Blinders sort of way, except no killing. At least I hope don't think so, right?
They don't.
Right?
No judgment. We listen and we do not judge.
Well, my mum said some weird things every so often, right? But it's like that looking at your family line and looking at their stories. Now, these are the stories that are filtered down through the family culture.
Right.
When you actually get, and this is where the energetics piece comes in, when you're able to move into actually communicating with your ancestors one-on-one, or as a group, right? And verifying these details. It's interesting then how details will emerge. And this is the cool thing. I often hear people who talk about when they're on Ancestry.com and they're building their family tree and something pops up and you suddenly get a nudge of insight, like, you're just reading a little record and you're suddenly like, overwhelmed with a sense of emotion.
Yeah.
And then when you go into look further, like for me, it was, you saw one of my ancestors had several children with the same name. That usually says that they've recycled the name, right?
Yeah.
And the wave of emotion that would come over me when I went to, the Egan Shrine and I worked with them and my Bovita, and I was communicating. That was verified for me. Yeah, that's what the situation was. So it's really looking at both, right? So what was cool for me was I discovered, like, I've always wondered, where is my magical side come from? Where is my interest in all of this comes from? I discovered that my mum's grandmother and great-grandmother were herbalists from Ireland that moved over to England in the very, very early 1910s, like late 1900s, right? And they had their own herbalism shop, which was one of the only, like, they were the very early form of pharmacists, right? And that was what was available to women at the time for self-employed business. So, of course, for my mum, being, somebody who comes from a long line of really strong self-employed women, my grandmother was the very first woman in England to get a betting shop license. So these are like you go in and you place bets. She stood outside the she stood outside the courthouse in Rotherham and demanded for like a full day just to get this license, because they were like scoffing, oh no, we won't give you that, but she did it, right?
Wow.
So I'm like, I can see, okay, herbalism, interesting. And she was like, oh yeah, all the tinctures. My mum's just like, oh, whatever, it's just, creepy, weird stuff. But when I looked into what they were doing, they were actually, preparing and serving the communities in the same way that, holistic practitioners would now. So that's where it comes from, right? It's fascinating. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
But what do we do with that?
Right.
That's when it's the relationship piece comes in. You develop relationships with these individuals. You work with them. You don't just walk into great grandma's house, sit down, and be like, okay, can you help me get like £1,000?
Yeah, feed me.
You develop. You talk. Yeah, exactly. You sit down. You have tea with them. You talk to them. You foster that relationship, and then the benefits come, right?
Yeah.
So it's really both sides. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I'm glad I like that you mentioned that there are these affinities and strengths, but also these weaknesses, because I feel like we talk maybe about the weaknesses a little bit more. You will hear the phrase generational curse more than you hear like generational blessing or skill or something like that, right? So people seem to be more concerned with the idea that the not so beneficial habits that they have, or the behaviors they engage in, or weaknesses that they perceive are coming to us from our ancestral lineages, whether biological or not, but also that there are these really great strengths and things that are taught to us. And that's something that I try to remind myself of in my own ancestral practice, that the folks that came before me, not to say that what we're dealing with today isn't difficult, but that there were difficulties of the past that I'm not certain I could have withstood.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would have survived debtor's prison. I don't know that I would have survived slavery. I don't know that I would have survived the Jim Crow era. Like, I don't know that I don't know that I would have survived no Grubhub. Like I might have starved. Like I don't know that I could trust that I would have like fed myself through the winter, so I try to remind myself that, like, yes, there are things that my ancestors, whoever they are, have gone through that are not so great, that are difficult, that I'm still working out of, that I'm carrying the vestiges of. But there are also all of these really great things, and strength in particular, because every single one of us that's alive at the present moment is literally a representation of like the strongest. Like we are the manifestation of survival of the fittest. Like every single person in our lineage had to have been the strongest in order to survive long enough to have whoever they had and keep them alive long enough for them to keep the next one. And so just our existence is a testament to the strength that we each carry. And it makes me think of the witch's adage of know thyself. Because for me, the more I have learned about my ancestors, the more I'm capable of. And I definitely think that comes from knowing myself. Talking with my aunt, I guess it's a little bit weird. I'm still getting used to these phrases. I just spoke to this person for the first time in my life, but she is my aunt. And she was telling me about my family history, and she was telling me about a great grandmother that was the oldest living slave in the town that she lived in. Like, she was like the oldest living person who had still experienced slavery. Like, she lived to be like 107 or something like that. And that, one of my uncles is a gentleman who like rebuilt like 3 times around Katrina, like storms in the New Orleans area. Because a lot of family, I guess, is from that area. And, the grandmother that lived for a really long time, I think she had a store. So she was an entrepreneur, and like just these interesting things that I'm learning about myself that make me feel like, oh, okay, these are skills, these are tools,
Yeah.
and these are relationships that
Yes.
I can further, that can make what I'm doing right now not seem so brand new, because
Hmm.
it's not. Somewhere in me, there's a part of me that already understands
Yeah.
what I'm trying to do and has done it already, and done it
Yes.
probably, well, and
Yes.
that I can take from that. And so there's that biological component, but there's also the non-biological component for all of us. I always try to remind people, and she's right here on our altar here at the office. But I think about people like Miss Cleo,
Yeah.
who I adore. I think about people like Walter Mercado, who, if you do astrology readings, if you do tarot readings on the internet in any kind of a capacity with like a camera in front of you, like, you do that because those two
You
did it
totally do.
first,
You
right?
totally do.
Like,
Yeah.
there would be nothing normal about tarot or astrology readings for just like a general public if it wasn't for them
Exactly.
navigating through that. And so I'm
Exactly.
obviously not biologically related to either of them as far as I know, but knowing that there
Hmm.
were readers putting themselves out in the public at a time where it was not common, it was, not generally accepted,
Yeah.
etc., even more than it is today, inspires me and moves me forward. So I feel like the biological ancestors, but also those affinity ancestors that you were talking
Yeah.
about, that's the word I use, like affinity ancestors, are also super helpful relationships to
They
have
totally
as you
are.
pursue like your various professions.
They totally are. You exist within the same energy that they exist within. You're just a new addition to that energy, right?
Mm,
And so, and this really comes back to my point at the beginning is, we get so locked into cultural definitions and categories. And when you look around the world, right, many cultures, most cultures, but many cultures, when they are enacting prayers for the ancestors, they say to our ancestors and all our relations, right?
yeah.
That's directly from a Mohawk prayer, or like a Moyuba from Lukumi, right? Whenever certain, ceremonies are performed, you include as many priests to an Orisha as possible in your Moyuba to add energy, to add oomph, to invite all of those ancestors. We look at saints in the
Mhm.
Catholic and the Orthodox tradition, right? When somebody walks in Ukraine or Russia or any of the other Orthodox traditions, walk into a church, what do you find? You see all the saints around you, their faces looking down. You're becoming part of this general community. And this, I think, is the most important piece that I think for Western culture in particular is lacking because of our individualism. It isn't just about us individually, it's about us in relationship with our community and their relationships with each other. And
Mm,
collectivism is, I would say, the norm in the world versus individualism. Individualism is really just a byproduct of a very specific historical process, which began with Martin Luther going and basically schisming the church in Europe, right? You have this
right.
idea that the individual and capitalism is, all about us, when really it's about us and all our relations. When you look at biological ancestry, there's this thing called generational breakdown, or this idea that the further back you go, the more ancestors you have until you have quadrillions of ancestors. So what
Mhm.
happens is when you actually really look at ancestral trees, it's more like an ancestral web, but you'll start to find that one individual shows up multiple different times. You are related to that individual in many different ways. So your individual story, and it doesn't take long, maybe 200 years, your individual story and your individual family line becomes actually the entire community. In which case,
Mhm.
then, you're not relating to an individual family, you're relating to the entire line, the entire culture, and the culture
Mhm.
then becomes your ancestor, right?
I love that. The culture becomes your ancestor. Um, Ancestral Whispers is such a wonderful addition to the literary world. I really enjoy seeing people from different backgrounds writing on the topic of ancestry, because I feel like when I first began exploring the craft, which was in the late 90s, that the books that were more available to me, which were more neo-pagan, didn't necessarily focus on ancestry so much. And when they did, it was very isolated to sort of like Greek, Roman, maybe Egyptian type of
Yeah.
ancestry. And this idea of trying to get everyone to connect to one of those like three categories. And over time that has changed, I think, with
Yeah.
people, especially with the ATRs, I think becoming more like mainstream and more like understood by the general populace better than it used to be. So I definitely encourage everyone to grab a copy. And I know that you talk about different ways of exploring veneration in Ancestral Whispers. That's the
Yeah.
focus, developing practices for
Yes.
yourself. But for this audience specifically, if I were a spiritual entrepreneur, I'm a tarot reader, I'm a Reiki healer, I'm a magician, I am someone that feels really drawn to the craft, to esoteric practices, and I also feel the desire to serve a role with that in some way. Um, where might you
Would you?
advise? Yeah, where might you advise that I start? Right, like I feel like I need
Yeah.
support. I'm doing something
Yeah.
I've never done before. As popular as it's become in this world, it's not necessarily accepted everywhere. So I might have to deal with some disdain or negative reactions from coworkers, family members, friends. I might kind of be setting myself up for, a whole new world, basically. Um, can I turn to my ancestors for that? And how might I start if I don't have an ancestral practice? How might I start connecting with my ancestors for the purpose of finding that type of support for spiritual work, like work?
Yeah. I think most people do it and they don't even realize that what they're doing is ancestor work. And what is that? They look at the people like you hit the nail on the head before. Look at Walter Mercado. Look at, I keep wanting to call her Yolanda. Sorry.
Yeah, Miss Cleo.
Miss Cleo. Look at Miss Cleo, right? And look at the people who came before you. We see this in the queer community, right? There's such an emphasis in the queer community teaching queer kids about queer history, right?
Yeah.
Where did we come from? The Stonewall riots, look at that whole history, right? And people do it anyways. They want to find out where they came from because they've already identified with that thing, with that idea, right? So with tarot readers, like look at Matt Oren, for example. I freaking adore Matt Oren so much.
Yeah, shout out
And,
to Matt. Love
love Matt
him.
Oren so much.
Yeah.
And a lot of our colleagues, right? A lot of the people who appeared on your show, a lot of us who are authors, for example, we have our own favorite authors who were influential to us when we were younger. And every single one of us who have been around a long time will have those people. A lot of people, it's Scott Cunningham, right? You look at people gushing over Christine whenever Christine is talking about her brother Scott. It's like there's so much love there. He's an ancestor to practice, right? Look, with Matt, it's some of the still living people like I can't coming off the top of my head here, but like
Silver Ravenwolf, probably.
Silver Ravenwolf, that's exactly it.
Yep.
Right?
I knew where you were going.
See, yeah, there we go. Matt. See, Matt. So it's looking at those and becoming inspired by those stories, right? Walter Mercado has a wonderful documentary about him, right? Miss Cleo has a TV show coming out about her, right? Biopic, right? Look at some of the others, right? Aleister Crowley is a big one for a lot of occultists. There's plenty of bios about him, right? Whoever, whatever it is, it's that finding support in community. And I think a lot of people already do that. We already have our heroes that we look up to. So then it's just shifting from just looking at that from a kind of, oh, they're cool people, to that literal hero worship that they used to do in many cultures around the world, right? That veneration practice, maybe set up a small shrine to some of those. And when you're feeling really down and blue in your practice, when you're really trying to struggle to gain clients, trying to find venues to go and sling cards at, trying to figure out what is the best deck that I'm using, right? And all of those feelings, go and sit and light a candle to those individuals and just communicate. put that out to them and be like, my ancestors, I'm feeling this. I'm feeling like I can't do this. Put it out to them, right?
Yeah.
And see that relationship. Yeah. The support's
Yeah.
there. Just need to
I've
access it.
I've had a lot of success with just that. And it's been I guess surprising whenever it happens, but I have literally had decks like just show up as gifts from, oh, I have a Kickstarter, or oh, I started a deck, or I'd love a review from you, and I just sent it along like right at the moment that I needed to do something. It's been so like freaky crazy weird. Like I was trying to figure out, I was connecting with some of my own spirit guides. And after doing that successfully with a few guides, I was like, oh, this is using the tarot. I was like, oh, this is sort of a spread or something. And they literally were like, you can do this for other people. Like, now that you've done this a few times, you can use this spread now to help other people connect with their spirit guides. And I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll put it like on my services menu.
Yeah.
And within a week, I had these 2 decks given to me from 2 different people that were perfect for this specific type of reading. And I only use those 2 decks together for this one specific type of reading.
Perfect.
But it literally was just, I was like, well, okay. I mean, and before you knew it, I had it, what I needed. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll do it okay, no problem. I'll put it on my menu. So, the relationships that we have with the energies around us can absolutely help us in like professional capacities. Sending people my way. My business coach is somebody that my grandmother, the spirit of my grandmother, told me at the altar while pulling cards. She was basically like, be on the lookout for this type of woman that's going to be able to help you. And then the week later, I meet Natasha, my business coach. And I was like, that's the Queen of Diamonds Grandma was talking about.
They have a much broader view of reality than us. This is why, so many people, when they actually start to get into these systems and start interacting with spiritual beings, whether it be ancestors or spirit guides, notoriously I like that, right? They're like, whatever, this is a bump in the road. It might seem devastating to us, but it's a bump in the road, right? I have a Jewish spirit guide. She's like very much like, get up,
Yeah. I'm not surprised there. Yeah.
But it's one of those things. It's like once you start to interact, you start to develop and you build up, right? Another very cool thing is and you hit it on the head. You have those 2 specific tools that you do this specific thing with, right? I don't think a lot of people, when they think of going into these circles, they think too Western in their mindset, right? I know tarot readers who they have an ancestral deck that they've initiated to their ancestors. Whether it be their biological or whether it be the affinity ancestors, and that's the deck that they will always use for certain types of reading, same as you, right? And for them, it's powerful. People don't. I think again we get very Western in our thinking. We need to move out of that Western thinking, right?
For sure. Well, I want people to drop their questions down in their chat if they have any. This is a great opportunity for you to get any questions that you have about connecting with your ancestors, your own ancestral practices, from someone who is doing a lot of studying on the topic. I also want to remind anyone listening to the podcast on podcast platforms that one of the benefits of subscribing to the YouTube channel and tuning in to the live streams of our recording sessions is you get to be in the room and get to ask questions of our fantastic guest co-host. So please make sure to subscribe over on YouTube, set up your notifications, all of that good stuff so you don't miss the live tapings of any of our upcoming episodes. And while folks are putting their questions down in the chat, Ben, I had just one last one for you, which is about Samhain and Samhain season and the time around October 30th to November 2nd, depending where you are in the world and what culture and what you're talking about and things like that. But folks often talk about that as an ideal time to connect with your ancestors. And I'm wondering if you have any thought about that, and whether there's something like special or in particular, or I guess if you're in the southern hemisphere, Beltane, May 1st. What are your thoughts on connecting with your ancestors at these particular times of year? Do you find that there's anything beneficial to doing that, or is that more new age?
It's one of those things where, so the idea of the thinning veil of a year is actually only 100 years old. It's not a very long tradition. It comes from, I believe, one of those, like the Golden Bough, like Fraser, or one of those antiquarians, right? The idea that there's a thinning veil. And then that was just picked up by, early neo-paganism, and it just became proliferated. The way I was trained in my own ancestral tradition and my own way of doing is every day. So I have an ancestral shrine always in my space, putting down food, lighting a candle, giving them molasses, giving them coffee, and it's not a particular time of the year. Now, that being said, thinking about energies, right? Samhain has become that big thing in particular circles because that's the expectation. And my experience with spirits is that they will often conform to what the community is expecting, because that's kind of how they operate. They go with that flow, right? So, I don't particularly think that there's anything really big around that time of year, except culturally in some of the cultures that my ancestors come from, that was a belief that, the waning part of the year was more of a time for spooky ghosts and whatnot to come out. But it was more about the spooky ghosts and the ancestors coming back and whatnot. Christmas time is actually a big one for a lot of people in England, particularly because traditionally that was a time that was a very liminal space. The 12 days of Christmas didn't really have anything going on other than feasting. So, that feeling that we just do whatever became a big thing. So, particular times, I think that's more of a cultural thing than it is necessarily a metaphysical thing. But spirits tend to conform. So if you're expecting a spirit to show up, they'll show up,
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Good to know. So you don't have to wait until May Day or Samhain, folks, to start building relationships with your ancestors.
Every day. Now, that being said, looking at the cultures that you're working with, right? Your dead human ancestors will have been involved with cultures themselves. That's the strength of community-based tradition, is that they are the ritual itself, the practices themselves become a form of communication, and that's why they're very powerful, right? Look at Coco, right? The Day of the Dead, right? The ancestors are expected to come on that day, so they come. They might be able to come all the time, but that's when they're expected. So if you're, if you are setting up a party and you send the invitation out and say, come on Saturday night at 7:00, and somebody comes at 6:00 on the Thursday, it's like, well, it's nice to see you, but like the party's actually then.
Yeah, exactly. No, I like the way you put that, because I feel like that's how I approach talking about like relationships with deities or anybody else, like especially when it comes down to like, well, if this deity is available to me, if the energy is available to me, why do I need to? I learned a lot about Hindu mysticism, so why do I need to do puja to a deity if they kind of transcend that? But I think that's a really great point, that the ritual itself becomes a part of the communication. It's like a language that they speak. And so if you are a part of a culture where your ancestral dead are also a part of that culture, it is a part of their language to connect with the family on certain days, or at certain times, or in response to certain offerings or songs or prayers or what have you. So that stuff it's not arbitrary in the sense that it's a part of the language. Now, may you not need it in order for you to understand what the energy is saying, and vice versa, certainly. But the ritual is not just a random collection of things, especially when we're talking about like cultures that have been doing the same thing for like hundreds of years, thousands of years. It becomes a part of the language of the communication that, a red rose be present, whatever it is. So that's a really great reminder.
right? There is always logic behind. Your task as a practitioner, especially coming into some of these traditions or practicing some of these traditions, is understanding the logic, right? And a very good example of this, and I write about it in my book. So one of the elders up here in Ontario in the pagan community, she is Irish and Anishinaabe background. And so one of the big things for her is when she's offering alcohol to her ancestors, she makes sure that she does not offer that alcohol to her Anishinaabe ancestors. Because in the Irish tradition, it is a life-fulfilling, it's a life-sustaining, it's a community-sustaining substance. But in the Anishinaabe tradition, it was poison, it's killed, it's destroyed. Like, I'm starting to get weepy just the way she was describing it, right? So completely inappropriate. And so she, like, that was her big moment of understanding, like, the nuances of relationships, right? When are you on your best behavior? When is it something that you just will not do, right? Even if you have a familiar relationship with an ancestor in certain settings, like, you know, you're not going to use somebody's nickname in a formal setting. You'll use their full formal name, right? You're respecting the context, you're respecting the understanding, you're respecting, it's all relational, right?
Right. Absolutely. Wow. Yeah. That I felt that too, where I was like, oh man. Thank you so much for sharing that with us and for chatting with us. I'm not seeing any other comments or questions down in the chat, which to me is always a good sign. It means that we have thoroughly covered this topic and we've answered everyone's questions. And so I thank you for that. I thank you for giving such thorough and thoughtful answers and this insight into how, you know, our ancestral connections can really help us in our lives, especially as we embark on our professional pursuits as practitioners. So tell us a little bit about what you are working on next and what we should be looking out for you, and how we can keep in touch about your next project.
Absolutely. So I've been working on it for the past year. This is my love letter to the UK. I've actually been working on several projects simultaneously. And what it is it's an encyclopedia / guidebook / walking tour of Wales. I've got one for England prepared, one for Scotland prepared, of magical practitioners in folklore. So, you know, a lot of people have been really interested in, you know, the Witch of the Woods, or who is this ancestor? This is really an ancestral practice for me. You know, who is this ancestor who is the Witch of the Woods, or the cunning man over here, or, you know, the goddess who's a witch over in this brook here. So this is a guidebook to the landscape and where these practitioners lived and what are their stories, really focused on the folklore as opposed to the history. And so that is coming out through History Press. We have to figure out the title because we've changed some things, but in September of 2025. And what I'm ecstatic about is I will be in the UK because I'm moving to the UK. I'll be in the UK when it comes out, so I can actually go to the landscape of these witches and cunning men and cunning women, wise folk existed within or are believed to have existed within. And I can go to those spaces. I've dedicated it to a witch who lived in the town where I was born, Arabella of Denbigh, who in the 1800s, very early 1800s, she was a tarot fortune reader. Well, no, she was playing cards. She was using playing cards to tell fortunes in the market in this little tiny Welsh town on market day. And her story has evolved over the years to take on many elements. So dedicated it to her as an ancestor, as a spiritual practice. So that will be coming out in September. And apart from that, I'm just working on a few other things. I've got something coming out through one of the Llewellyn Sabbat 2026. I've got a little ritual for the dead for Leaf, I believe it was, or Lammas, one of those. Apart from that, you can find me at benstimson.com. That's where all my socials are. And of course, Ancestral Whispers is available on your website as of this recording. So if anybody is interested, go to Ali's website and find it there.
Thank you. I'm very looking forward to that next project. It reminds me of a book called Accused of Witchcraft in New York. I love reading about the witches of old, because the stories about them are really cool and really inspiring when you think about, now we have the World Wide Web that can connect all of us and crystal shops and all of that stuff. But imagine being like the witch in your town where like no internet you're the one, you are the one. And so if the town decides that you are not cool and they're not happy with you, it's you against them. And how strong a person has to be to be able to bring their practices to the world with their desire to serve people, regardless of, what's changing in politics, religion, or what have you, of the day. So I'm very much looking forward to the information that you share in that project. Much luck to you as you work on it. And thank you so, so much for being with us here for season 4. I really appreciate it. For everyone who is watching, thank you so much for tuning in. This is sort of the soft launch of season 4, a little sneak peek into a recording of one of the episodes. So much more coming for you guys in 2025 on this channel. So if you haven't already, make sure to like this video, click the subscribe button, and make sure you turn on your notifications, okay? Because we're going to have a bunch of episodes coming up, but I've got to be flexible for all of our guests. So turning on your notifications is how you're going to know when an episode is going down. Tuning into an episode on YouTube means you get to participate in the Q&A. You get to speak directly to our co-host and to myself. So it's definitely a good idea to do so. Be here, be early to the conversation. So have a great rest of the day, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in, and blessed be.